That was not what was supposed to happen, but it's fine. We're live and I don't know why it's looping. Okay.
YOLO. We'll do it in production, right?
All right. Well, this is where we can fix it in post edit at
There
some
we
point.
go.
I don't know. I've actually discovered that YouTube takes extremely long time to process. So you can cut out like 10 seconds on YouTube, but
Right.
then it then sits in processing for 4 hours or something, or like longer. I'm like, oh my God, I cut out 4 seconds. I just didn't want to download, re-upload, deal with it. I'm like, come on. Right. So, it's a whole thing. But yeah, technology is complicated. So,
It
this is
is.
what
It's a
happens.
surprise. It's a surprise it works. It's not surprising when it fails.
Yeah, computers were a mistake. I think I'm not quite at that level today, but they mostly work. It's actually amazing how well they work for the most part.
For the most part.
For the most part, I try not to think about software where I'm flying in an airplane because I'm like,
Uh-huh.
I know
Yeah.
how testing is done. I know how I know how reliability is done. I know how many factors interact in a complex system that's built of hardware and software.
But
Um,
at some point you just have to give it up to the universe. Like there's nothing you can do about it either. So like
yeah,
just let it go.
yeah.
Just yeah.
It, so what was supposed to happen is we're supposed to introduce each other, right? So hi and welcome everyone to the Ergonomic Podcast. And today with me is Nathen Harvey. And Nathan, would you like to tell us a story about how you got here and why we're talking today?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm in my home office, so I just came down the stairs and I walked right here. That's how I got here. No, that's not really how I got. I mean, it is really how I got here. But Sasha and I, wow, I don't know when we first met, Sasha. It's been many, many years. I think the first time I met you, and I put that in air quotes, was maybe on the Arrested DevOps podcast. That's probably the first time I heard you.
Yeah, that potentially is a thing.
Yeah.
And we were at Chef, I believe, at
I,
that
I
point.
I was definitely a chef at the time. Yes, indeed. Yeah. So I've spent, I don't know, longer than I'd care to admit in this technology space, doing everything from being a software engineer through being essentially a CMO, a CFO. Like I've done everything in this space. But for the last 5 years or so, I've been at Google, really as a developer advocate, working in the space of software delivery, of software operations like SRE, and really focused on the DORA research program. Prior to Google, as you mentioned, I was at Chef for a bunch of years. And then prior to that, I was at a company called Custom Ink. You may have heard of them. You go online, you design t-shirts, they ship them off to you. And I was managing all of our web operations back at that time.
That's
Yeah, that's
amazing.
so
All good companies. So I actually didn't know about the CMO and CFO part. So you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. It's kind of a little bit tongue in cheek. I was at a startup, like a venture backed startup. Actually, it's a great story because I was hired while this venture backed startup was still in stealth mode, and I was hired as the director of customer support. Do you know what a stealth company doesn't have? Any customers. So
Right.
it was amazing to be in charge of customer support because, and this is the thing that I still lament to this day, no one ever calls up customer support and says, "Hey, thank you. Y'all are doing great. I just wanted to let you know that." People, when they call customer support, you're usually angry or you have a problem. So it was a glorious few moments being that director of customer support. But then the CEO fired all of the engineering staff, and I was suddenly the most technical person on staff, and chaos ensued. We eventually launched. The company grew, and then the venture capital market kind of dried up. So this was a while ago. The company contracted. It contracted down to basically the CEO and 3 employees. And the CEO looked at me and said, "Well, if we're going to be such a small company, we need someone of our employees, of our 3 employees on the board. Nathen, you run operations, so that feels like board style. So come join the board, and we'll have board meetings every month. And now you're in charge of marketing and look after these finances." Yeah, so like, sure, I was a CFO and a CMO in this 4-person company. That's
Okay. Well, that's so cool. You get to put it on your resume. And sometimes, I feel like in a startup, because we're a small startup right now, and this is the
yeah,
second time I'm in a small startup, and it just like you get to wear so many hats, and it's both exhilarating and it's exhausting sometimes, because it's like, oh, I didn't know anything about this yesterday, and I'm like learning how to pay taxes. This is
Yes. Yeah.
okay.
It is super fun and energizing, and there's a ton of title inflation. I already called myself a CFO and a CMO, right? There's clear title inflation there. But I think the thing that you learn about this, and I think that this kind of stuck with me through my entire like operational career, is like you show up and you do the work that needs to be done. And if there's something that needs doing, there's no one coming to save you. Go do that work. Go whatever that work happens to be. Just look at the work in front of you and make some progress on it.
I think in big companies also, like, the Andrew has the saying, like, the company is held together by people who are doing something that's not in their job description, like, right? Because like if you strictly did your job description, and if everybody strictly did that, like no organization would ever survive, right? So it's the people who fill the gaps that make it work. But
Yes.
big companies are very, very different from small companies, and it surprisingly, it's not actually the amount of politics. I think that the amount of politics exists everywhere. Like everywhere, there's some type of like
People are going to
people
politic.
fighting,
Yes.
yeah, over titles, over who's in charge, over like there's always something. Even in flat company, I actually feel like flat companies are worse than in the hierarchical
Mhm.
company, because you technically don't have a leadership, but you do, and you have to figure out who's the most important person you need to get an approval from or whatever, and who you got to get on board, and it gets exhausting at a certain size. Um, but yeah, but big companies are like the dynamics are way worse, and well, not worse. It's hard to get things done
Mhm.
because everything requires lots of approvals. So it's like this is the problem with big company. It's like convincing people that they can just move forward with a thing instead of like, oh no, we got to ask permission from this and this and this person, and we got to officially sign out, and then you go into meetings about meetings about meetings, and that's just like, so you've been at Google for 5 years at that point. Is that the experience? I don't know. Like Google is a huge
Yeah.
company.
Yeah. Google, of course, Google is a large company. And I would say that like the other thing that's true about large companies is oftentimes they can get things done at scale, and they're always changing. So like the thing that was true about Google 15 years ago before I joined, that like the way that you might describe it then is completely different to how it actually works today. And of course, the way anyone describes how it works is probably not the full honesty of how it works as well. So I think that yes, complex organizations, well, they're complex. The size is one sort of measure of that complexity and how it gets complex. But yeah, I think it's really fascinating. I think the other thing, when you get into a larger organization, you start to hear echoing around the halls, whether it's said out loud or just subtext, phrases like "that's not your job" or "that's not my job," and people tend to want to stay within those bounds. And that's very different to like we're just talking about smaller organizations where there's something needs doing, I'm going to do it. And then in those larger organizations, if you have that personality where you're going to do the thing that needs doing, regardless of whether or not it's on your job role, whether or not it's in your job description, sometimes that gets rewarded, sometimes that gets crushed. And the truth is that even that may change over time. This week, it might be a thing that's rewarded. Great job. You did the thing that no one else was doing and it needed doing. Congratulations. And then next week, it might be just the opposite reaction.
I totally agree with you. I think in my personal experience, asking for forgiveness rather than permission has always worked out for me. But I do know,
Mm.
like you can, cross an invisible line and get in trouble, and then, get in trouble for doing the right thing, which is ironic.
Yeah, and then you also back to like humans and politics, like you start to recognize where there are privilege lines as well, and so the lines that you might cross are very different for each individual within that organization.
So I don't know, this wasn't necessarily planned to be talking about organizational dynamics, but I find it very interesting conversation, so we can kind of stick to that. I think one interesting thing that you just alluded to is when I was inside big companies, it was much harder to tell people the truth.
Mm.
Um, so like if you come across a team and they're struggling and you know exactly why they're struggling, or at least you have some good advice you can give them, it's really difficult to come in and be like, hey, this practice you're having, it's not actually good. It's hurting you. Here's a report that says that, this is a bad idea, whatever. Because people kind of territorial, people wanna know that they're doing a good job, and you gonna work with them for potentially years to come, and so you're kind of
Mhm.
afraid to offend them. Whereas from the outside, so we're doing consulting right now, right? And it's a lot easier for me to come in and people actually ask me, like, tell me what I'm doing wrong, like, right? And that's a whole empowering position where I can actually tell them, like, hey, have you thought that this might not be good? And their reaction is way less defensive and way more open.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. And I do think it's also important that for those people that you're giving that advice to, yes, they want that advice, but and I struggle with this from time to time as well. How are they going to actually be able to act on that advice? Do they have the fortitude? Do they have the latitude within their organization to actually take that advice and put it into practice? Because I oftentimes also work with teams, and I'm sure you've done this as well, where they know what's holding them back, or they know what's bad, and they know the better way. But the thing that they've never been able to do is actually work in that better way or work in that different way, try that out, because there's just so much organizational friction and sort of entropy. Like, we're going to keep doing things the way that we've always done them because it's been successful, because we have policies that say we have to stay this way. And so driving that change, I think, it's so important and very difficult to do from time to time.
And so this is actually interesting. Another super empowering thing that I discovered about consulting. And I've been in consulting before, but it was more like driving implementations. Whereas
Yes.
now we're mostly giving people advice. Like that's a lot of what we
Mhm.
do. We're teaching people, we're giving people advice. And so it's interesting because people come to us and they tell us they're like, their biggest hope is that they will tell us things that will then bubble up high enough
Mhm.
that this will be heard because they've been feeling like they've been screaming for 10 years and nothing changes, and like there's a problem here and I know exactly what it is, just give me the leeway to like fix it.
Yes.
Kind of exactly what to say. And interestingly, when I was inside the organization, sometimes I would be like, hey, do you want me to go talk to your boss? Because I can, and I don't have to mention your name. I can just say, hey, from my experience, we should be doing X, Y, Z. And people would be like, no, 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 I don't want to, don't do that. Like, because they're worried about the dynamics and the politics and whatever, and like crossing some lines. And it's definitely a different experience from the outside.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think our role as coaches is to empower those practitioners. Like, what words can you say to your boss? How do you frame this? And sometimes that just requires, maybe as an outsider, we can see the perspective of the leader, of the executive, of the boss, whomever that person is. Like, maybe we can see their perspective a little bit differently than the people inside the organization can. And I think just the idea of building that empathy and understanding, well, here's what that team is after, here's how they're incentivized, and maybe my incentives are slightly different to that, but let me think about, how do I put this into the language that they'll understand, and how do we open up those lines of communication and better empathy across those groups, I think is really, really important. And then I fully agree with you. Like, I will sometimes ask people that I'm working with, what are the things that you've been trying to say to your leadership that they aren't listening to? I'm an outsider. They will listen differently, for better or worse. Let me amplify some of your messages there.
I guess we just arrived at like why people hire consultants for
I guess
organizational
so.
transformation. Well, because it's actually a very surprising experience to me how different this is and how different dynamics play out. Where like when you come in from the outside, people are a lot more open and a lot more open to you talking to the leadership because again, if it comes from the outside, like they can always be like, oh, I had nothing to do with this. I don't this
Uh-huh.
wasn't me. Like, but if the leadership ends up listening, then they win. If the leadership ends up not listening, you can blame the consultant, and the consultant goes away, and everything goes back to the kind of the status quo that you had beforehand.
Yeah, and then the interesting dynamics around, advice that you pay for versus advice that you get for free,
Yes.
is another very interesting thing. That, yeah.
There's another dynamic. So this one's obvious, but when you're inside the company and you say, I've worked for 20 different companies, here's what we should do, this is generally not accepted no matter what organization it is, like they will
Right.
tell you like we're not like everybody else, we're, you don't
Mhm.
know that we're so special, blah blah. And if you're coming from the outside, that's your biggest cred. Like, right, I've worked with lots of different organizations, I've consulted with lots of different organizations. This is all like things that I know from experience of
Mhm.
watching a lot of people in this similar situation. So like this is a very, very different dynamic, how something that inside the organizations approach defensively, from the outside suddenly becomes your street cred.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And like to drive that actual change, it takes time and commitment. It doesn't happen overnight. No change happens as fast as any of us want it to happen. That I think is pretty universal. And so you've got to stay committed to it and recognize that you're going to stumble along the way.
Yeah, and I think, lots of, so I think every company is sort of in a perpetual state of transformation, and all of them kind of grow into each other. And like the interesting part is that a lot of them are considered unsuccessful, where we actually find that people have achieved success. So, like, if you compare something that happened 5 years ago to something that happens now, the organization improved dramatically. But because the success is gradual, and there's still pain points, and there's still like they still usually get stuck in the non-ideal state, like, right, because you can't get to an ideal state probably any time. Um, then there's kind of no celebration of these successes and no recognition. And also, again, you get stuck at a particular part of the journey, and then you kind of don't manage to get unstuck, and you run out of leadership, kind of sponsorship or budget or whatever it is, and everything kind of stalls.
Absolutely. That sort of continuous improvement or continuous change, at least, right? And then you couple that with in large organizations, another thing that is pretty common is reorganizations, and leaders coming and going and leaving, and so having to retrain your leadership onto what your mission is, or maybe having them try to force a new mission on your team. And then also, I think that there's this idea of, it's very difficult to change an organization. Maybe we should start with a team. And I know that if we can't change one team, if we can't change the way that one team works, the way that one team behaves, the outcomes that they achieve, we're going to have an even more difficult time trying to change the entire organization. So when we start with one team, figure out what works well within this organization today, move on to the next, move on to the next. Now we have some patterns that we can start to amplify up across the
So I
organization.
agree with that, but you kind of, in my experience, you have to go both from top and bottom at the same time. Because if you don't
Yes.
have buy-in at like a certain, at pretty high level of organization, if not the highest,
Yep.
you just like your organizational dynamics are gonna, like, you can have perfect practices on a single team, and that will not matter, because most things, like, reliability usually requires buy-in from so many stakeholders. Like,
Yes.
it's not just the developer team, it's not just the ops team, it's not just the security
Yep.
team. You kind of have to have buy-in from everybody, at least like agreement on the things that are important, and agreement on how we measure them, and work with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for that, like if we talk about reliability in particular, really the team is the group of humans that are responsible for that application or service. And so in most organizations, that is not a single team. That is a bunch of components from a bunch of larger teams. So you have this cross-functional team who cares most about this application. We've got to get all of those players in the room together on the same page, aligned well, and driving that forward. Otherwise, yeah, like you said, we're not going to make the progress we need.
Yeah, and then leadership buying is often important, because leadership will push you to sort of incentivize like new features, right? New
Yes.
features is the hot thing that always happens. And so, like, usually leadership is like, deliver something tomorrow. We don't care how, we don't care what, like, like,
Mm-hmm.
don't care about who comes in on a weekend, just make it happen. And so
Yes.
if you don't have a buy-in for, like, yes, that's important, but if we're not reliable, no matter how many bells and whistles we put in our software, people are not going to enjoy using it, which means people are going to leave us. Like, if you don't have that sort of agreed upon, at least theoretically, like, those contracts need to be sort of signed, quote unquote. where you can make this argument and be like, hey, we broke down for 20 minutes this month. We cannot take risks, like, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think it all just points back to, like, why do we even have technology? It's not so that we can have technology. It's because we're trying to create a great experience for the user. And that great user experience keeps the users coming back, helps our organization find more success, whether that's more profit or whatever. However we measure organizational success, we get that because we're serving our customers and because we're creating great things that they want and they want to continue to use, continue to come back to us for whatever it is that we're offering. And shipping new features or really, there are so many things that ignore the fact that, oh, right, there's a customer on the other end of this transaction. There's a customer there that's who we need to focus on. And we need to have that alignment across all of these different departments so that we're serving that customer.
Yeah, and like you think about like what solves like actually important problems. So like Google is a prime example. Google search is a prime example of like there's not much on that page. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, that's a design decision, and that's a design decision that periodically has to be fought wars over, right? Right? Not to overload the page with bells and whistles. If you compare it to like what Yahoo search used to be in the early days, it's like everything was flashing at you, and here you have like this one search bar, and like this is a thing you have to think about. It's like if it actually solves the core problem, new feature like it's been what 20 years, I don't know, longer, how long
Yeah.
Google has existed, like it's been many years, and the core problem hasn't changed. We can argue about like, maybe we have a shift now with AI, and stuff is going to be different. We can say, oh, you can now search images or whatever, like cool, but like the core functionality remains the core functionality, and well, as long as you're solving a problem, you don't necessarily need to constantly like add new fun bells and whistles to your stuff.
That's right. And speaking of the age of Google, if I have my math correct, Google is one half of a hip hop. So hip hop celebrates 50 years this year, and I'm pretty sure Google celebrates 25.
All right, that's um I don't know, this is a digression, but so the thing that I think changed is we used to people don't think in keywords, right? Like our brains are not built for keywords. Our brains are built for analogies and stories, right?
Yes.
And I think humans have optimized themselves for Google rather than Google optimizing themselves for, in a way, like we all search in keywords now. I actually think there's a deterioration of web searches. I feel like over the last say 5 years, like my the quality of the results keeps going down, and it I don't know what dynamics are leading to it. I think maybe it's everyone's optimizing for SEO, and now like nobody knows who's actually doing it. I don't know, but definitely feels like, so again, maybe ChatGPT type stuff can save us because it might be better, but we'll see how that dynamic evolves.
We'll see how that goes. But maybe there's an alternate perspective on this, Sasha. Maybe you've just become so much smarter that you just can't find the answers you're looking for on the web.
No, I think there's just like there's a deterioration in being able to find the real content, and a lot more advertising, and it's not always paid advertising, right? But it's
Sure.
it's like non-relevant things that pop up on the first pages of results, and it's not just Google, it's like all of the search engines. It doesn't actually help. So yeah.
Yeah.
The ChatGPT has been amazing compared to Google search. However, you don't know if it's making things up. So that's not a problem. So like you get better results. Sometimes you get pretty amazing results to like asking questions, but then
Uh-huh.
like, are you hallucinating, or are you true right now?
Yeah. And of course, Google is starting to introduce some of that stuff as well. But I work in Google Cloud, not in Google Search, so I can't really speak a whole lot about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes. So actually, speaking where you work,
Yes.
I think we briefly brought up incentives And I think generally a lot of the things we do are about incentives, right? If you want to figure out why people are doing an illogical thing, find why they're getting paid or rewarded for doing that illogical thing. Usually you will find it, right? And
Absolutely.
metrics have a lot to do with that. I'm a big believer in measuring things, but
Mhm.
it's kind of easy to get it wrong, right? So
Yes. Yeah.
metrics are these kind of worms. It's like you have companies that just don't measure, right? Like
Yep.
that's one problem. You have companies that measure kind of a very static subset of things. So they have data. No one really
Mhm.
looks at it. No one really knows how to analyze it, and it's just kind of sitting there. And then you have companies that gain insight, like right. So it's not just measurement; it's insight. And then that one of the problems in between is like you will measure one or two things and over focus on these one or two things, and then kind of drives you towards your own behavior. So
Absolutely.
um, I know you work a lot with DORA, so like, how about we kind of talk about the DORA metrics and the good
Yeah.
and bad and the ugly
I'd
of the.
I'd love to, but first, before we get to Dora, I want to tell a story that I learned very early in my career about the challenge with misaligned incentives. I was working for a software company that was working with a CPG company, consumer packaged goods, and one of the goods that this particular company packaged was breakfast cereal. It's still morning, right? So breakfast cereals. We went on site and we were talking with a couple of folks at this breakfast cereal manufacturer. The first person we talked to was in charge of inventory and like sort of the supply chain, if you will. And we said, "Hey, what gets you your bonus? How do you get paid?" And they said, "Well, it's easy to answer that question. I get paid when we have just-in-time deliveries. Imagine this: a customer takes a box of cereal off of the grocery store shelf, and another box goes on the back. So I have no inventory in the system. I'm delivering just in time. That's how I get paid." I said, "Okay." Then we went over to the plant, the production plant, and we asked the plant manager, "How do you get your bonus? How does your team get rewarded? How do you get promoted, etc.?" And they said, "Oh, well, that's super easy. We get paid based on the tonnage of cereal that we produce every quarter. So we get paid by weight of cereal that we produce." So imagine this: it's the end of the quarter, and you're the plant manager, Sasha. You and your team are behind on your quotas, and you have a choice. You can either make bran flakes with raisins in them, or you can make puffed rice cereal. Which one are you going to make at the end of the quarter to make sure that you get your bonus?
Well, the one, the heavier one, right?
Yeah,
Obviously.
the bran flakes with raisins, right? But who's ever had a raisin bran treat, right? We've had Rice Krispie treats; those are delicious. So by you focusing on how do I get paid, you are actually taking money out of the pocket of that inventory manager who wants just-in-time deliveries, low inventories, and the customer probably isn't happy. A customer maybe that wants to make raisin bran treats, oh, they don't. They want to make Rice Krispie treats, and so that's a
Well,
great
there's
example.
another problem here, right? And that
Yeah,
is the one person wants a lot of inventory and the other person wants as little as possible inventory. And these
exactly.
incentives are directly opposite to one another, right?
Completely opposite. Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
and actually there's also accounting. So, I don't know if you read, so you probably read The Goal, but there's also a book called It's Not Luck, by
Okay.
Eliyahu Goldratt, and he talks
Uh-huh.
about that a lot. So he's generally very focused on like inventory problems,
Yes.
um, which is amazing in relation to software because we don't talk about it, but software has inventory too, and it's a problem too, and you have like dark queues and all of that stuff. But
Of
anyway,
course. Yes. Yes.
um,
Sorry, back to Dora. You mentioned something about metrics, I think, with Dora.
no. So we can talk about inventory, and so like basically there's also accounting practices that force people
Yep.
to either hold on to inventory or not. And in a
Yes.
lot of places, like if you stop holding on to inventory, it actually looks like you're making a loss on your books. So that's another
Hmm.
major incentive to not
Yes.
make it easier. Like basically accumulate inventory that makes everything worse for your manufacturing.
Hmm. Yes, absolutely. And so this is these are things that in the technology space we take lessons from other places. Sometimes we take them too far, right? So when you think about things like manufacturing and you think about like a production line, you might end up thinking that, well, what we need is a feature factory, and that's, oh boy, that's like a whole other can of worms, and not thinking about the differences between like producing hundreds, thousands of the same vehicle is very different than producing changes that you want to your software system, because you're not producing hundreds and thousands of the same change over and over and over again. Software is always changing. The technology is always changing. So you're always building something different. And so sometimes we go a little bit too far with taking lessons from elsewhere and trying to force them on the work that we do that is maybe creative in a different way than maybe automobile manufacturing, as an example.
Yeah, that definitely happens. I think about it like, so one of the biggest problems with software is that work is invisible, right? And making work visible, again, I'm quoting it, but
Mm-hmm.
making work
Yes,
visible
absolutely.
is a problem, right? But it is like, so inventory, for example, is invisible. And what happens, so if you think about a Jira board or like, Kanban board of some
Yes.
sorts, um, that the purpose of that is to make work visible. But what happens usually in kind of software engineering process is you have one team on that board, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once it leaves the team, there's no like
Yeah.
continuation in this, right? So this work, like it looks like it was delivered, but then before it gets on someone else's kind of board or nothing at all, like what happens to that work? So a lot of times you have the dark queue at the end of this
Yes.
that just keeps spinning, and it's invisible to us, so we don't realize how much it impacts our delivery time or other things that we care about.
Absolutely. That brings us back to like systems thinking, and we have to see the whole system. And uh, oh, there was something else that popped into mind, and now it's gone. So like it vanished. It's often my dark queue. It'll come back in a minute.
Well, you'll discover it later, and we'll realize that you were spinning on it. Queues are fascinating in general because queues work in ways that you don't expect.
Mm-hmm.
And so like if you have a super lengthy queue, it literally it's not linear. Like the wait times are not linear. It's
Right.
kind of fascinating. It's the opposite of the intuitive thing that you think when you look at how it works.
Yes. And if you don't see all of it, right, you come back to this idea, and it's come back to me out of my dark queue, the definition of done. When is this thing done? Right. And if I'm a software developer and my job is to write the code and get it into the version control system, maybe that's when I say I'm done. But that's certainly, there's no value in that code yet. It has to get out to our users. But if my job, if my incentives focus me only on getting it to a certain state and not fully delivered, it's very different. It's very
Well,
different. Right?
yes, and that happens a lot. Like so even like DORA definition of like lead time is different
Mm,
than like there's many ways to define the same quote unquote metric, and they
absolutely.
give you different results. And then there's just plain horrible metrics. So I'm not a fan of velocity in general. Like velocity is
Hmm.
a metric that's easily gamed and very unrepresentative of any like positive change that happens. But it's like every agile transformation in the world will tell you how they improve things because velocity got faster. It's like, ah, um, but there's worse things like lines of code or number of PRs that you can measure, and it's like
Yes.
okay, like is this really like how many logs we've chopped? Like I can create lines of code very easily. That doesn't
Yes.
actually mean anything for my
Yes.
productivity. Um, the problem with, well, actually that's the problem with everything, but in software in particular, how do you measure the value you deliver to your customers? It's
Hmm.
actually very difficult to set up metrics for your customers. And in tech organizations, usually you have that, and you really kind of pretty strongly focused on actually like talking to your customers in all these different ways to solicit their feedback. But in a lot of other places, you literally just never talk to the customer. Like it's just like assumptions are made about what customers need, and you actually don't know, and you never take time. And it's not even if it like focus group works in some cases. It's not always the answer, but the point is you have to gain feedback from how you're doing, because maybe you just made this major change to the application that like you think was amazing, and now I just deleted my phone application because I can't use it anymore because it broke something that was really important to me.
That's right. And maybe that amazing thing that you shipped that broke my experience today, if I stick with using that application, maybe I'll come to realize that it was an amazing change and it changed my behavior and how I interacted. And so it can be very difficult to know right away, is this change a good change or a bad change for our customers? How is it impacting customer behavior and customer satisfaction? Are our customers still happy with this application? And actually, when we get back to like reliability, it's really a measure of, are you able to keep a typical customer happy with the level of service they're getting from your application? That's our goal. Keep a typical customer happy. And
Yeah.
it can be really challenging to figure out who is a typical customer and what keeps them happy. And the truth is, what keeps them happy today is not the same as the thing that will keep them happy in 3 months and 6 months and 12 months and 18 months.
And but this is important. So I don't think a lot of people measure consistency, but consistency is actually really important to like human experience with anything and then with technology, right? Because
Yeah.
you don't want to have a good experience today and bad experience tomorrow, or like you don't want something that was chill yesterday to have flashing lights tomorrow. Like
Yes.
you want your expectations are going to be met, and so like if you're making a technology change, it has to be either explained enough or gradual enough that we can slowly kind of onboard into it and not be expected to completely change our behavior while interacting with a piece of technology.
Absolutely. And that, I've seen examples of that as well, where you take maybe a green screen mainframe application and you move it to something more modern. Well, the operators of that application, like, they have muscle memory in their pinkies for how many tabs they need to hit before they get to the next field that they're going to enter information for, and then the correct number of pinky flicks to get to the next field and enter that in. And then you move it to a web-based interface or something. And yes, it looks beautiful. It
Made
looks
it
more
easier.
intuitive. It's easier, but not for that operator, not for the person that's been doing this same task, this same job in the same way for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You've made their life more difficult. And so understanding that, how that component works and who are your users, I think it's so crucial.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of research in terms of like how much usability matters and how much like you can't actually. So the airline example is like if you make two levers look the same, people will accidentally pull the wrong lever, right, and
Right.
crash the plane potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And like the solution to that is not education or talking about it or like the solution to that is make it obvious what needs to
Yes.
happen. Like right, and we kind of a lot of times forget about it. It's like, oh yeah, we just need to educate people, and sometimes you do. There's kinds of products that are so definitely new that you need to kind of break through that initial like I don't understand this
Mm-hmm.
type of resistance, and then where the adoption curve matters and all that stuff. But in most cases, you need to be intuitive. And so there's another problem with like sort of customer measuring customer experience, which is people tell you things they believe that aren't true, right, about what they want and how they
Mm-hmm.
interact with your software or anything. And then the only reliable way to actually measure is to watch people do things.
Yes. And then depending on how you watch them, right, you may impact how they behave and interact with the system. If I come, I mean, I know this from my own personal experience. If I sit down and I'm writing a document and you're looking over my shoulder, or we're sharing the document in, say, a Google Meet, I am going to have more typos because you're watching than I would otherwise, right? And so just the mere fact of knowing that I'm being observed changes in some way my behavior and the way that I'm interacting with that system. And so then in technology, we also have things like, there's feature flags and A/B tests, and we can get a lot of data from that. And we know that a lot of times when we run an A/B test, that it gives us exactly the opposite result that we expected it to do. Right? We thought that this changing the color of this button was going to make things better, and we'd get more conversions based on that. Turns out the conversion rate went down. It's good that we learned that. Let's flip back. But
But it
it
is
takes.
again, this is again a company like Google who measures first of all optimizes the color of the button for 3 years,
Right.
and then measures the actual conversion rate, right? And this is all systems that we theoretically need to be set up, but in most places there aren't, right? So
Yes.
it's someone decided that the color of the button is going
Yep.
to change, and they actually never learn unless there's a drastic change, like people stop registering. There's that Etsy story that
Mhm.
was pretty amazing. It was I guess about the danger of UI tests and stuff like that without like actually having a human in the process.
Yes.
Where they they made some changes, and then suddenly people stopped registering for the website. And
Uh-huh.
so they spent a few days like literally being like, what did we do? Did we, and they were thinking about like change user experience, like you made the shop worse. That's why people are not registering.
Mhm.
And then because they had a huge suite of UI tests and they were all passing, everything was fine. Turns out that accidentally someone made the color of the register button the same as the color of the background.
Right. So they made the
So
button
people
invisible.
physically could not find the
Hmm.
register button. So and
Hmm.
we give up very easily. Our patience, especially now after 20 years of playing with the internet, like our
Yes.
patience is very low, right? So we just couldn't find the button, didn't register, right? And so it literally took them a few days for someone to physically go look at the website, which
Right.
which sounds pretty mind blowing, but this is really what happened. Um, and it's like you have to know, you kind of have to balance all of these things. Um, but it's also like for most organizations, it's very expensive to
Hmm.
be able to generate the level of kind of quality controls that we all want to have, right? And then there is this perpetual focus. So it's like I feel like, and again I've said this on this podcast many times, like we're optimizing sort of the development, like we
Mm.
again the pendulum of technology. So for a long time operators are kind of dismissed and considered unimportant. And then we, like the whole DevOps transformation, we said, oh, we need to actually fix some problems for ops people so that they have a better experience. And now we kind of like again shifted back to talking about developers. And I can say this as a former developer, like developer experience is cool, shipping new features is cool, but it's not everything that matters. And so we kind of over optimizing for that. It's easy to get budget for new features. It's easy to get budget for like doing new things and delivering the ROI and whatever. And it's kind of easier for people to connect that to productivity and ROI. Whereas ops, you kind of get this like, really, they're just keeping the lights on. It's like, yeah, but have you calculated how much it costs you when you have downtime? Have like the goodwill that you lose, and also like kind of the actual money that you lose in the in case of incidents. And worse,
Hmm.
even if you don't have incidents, but you have little humans plugging the holes in your ship
Right.
physically by staying awake in the middle of the night on the weekend, and it just like not seen by any metric, and just very problematic.
Yeah, I think there's this interesting dynamic where, like, on the operations side, nobody cares about operations until things are broken. So we only put a light on operations when things are bad. And on the development side, like maybe we mostly, and I shouldn't say only, but like oftentimes shine a light on developers when new features are flying out, right? So they're delivering great new things. Now, in both of those cases, we don't actually know what's the value of either keeping things up or shipping those new features, or the detriment, like maybe it's opportunity cost or maybe it's real value that we've lost in not shipping features or in having those outages. And again, I think this goes back to this idea that we need to look at the whole system, and we need to understand and talk about how are we delivering value. What does value look like for this particular application, for this service, for this organization? And you can't have a value conversation, or it's very difficult to have a value conversation without considering who that user is and really focusing on, well, who are we doing this for, right? And so I think there's some really interesting dynamics there. And I think you're right that the other thing that's true in the world, I guess, is that there are these pendulum swings, and we will over focus on an area from time to time. And eventually, like maybe over time, we reach some sort of balance. But certainly in the moment, it can feel like we're very developer centric. Like in today's world, we are very much focused on developer productivity, which is a good thing. Our developers should be productive, and where the line of who's a developer and who isn't is a blurry one, and I think that's good. But we have to remember that we're trying to deliver value, not features or lines of code or pull requests or what have you.
And coming back to kind of DORA things, I think
Yeah.
my biggest pet peeve. So first of all, DORA tried to like balance, right? And they tried to have four metrics, and they they try to have sort of balance between developer and operations actually. But I think what I tend to find is the thing people heard is that you should just deliver code faster, right? That maybe because it's easiest to measure, maybe because it's like easiest to evangelize. I'm not sure, but basically, like when you talk to people about DORA, usually what you hear is like, yes, code delivery, the deployments, the number of the frequency of deployments, and how fast you get to the deployment, like right. And I constantly run into this where like folks are like, oh, we just got to deliver faster, deliver faster, deliver faster. It's like you actually like don't like you have other problems and
Yes.
delivering faster. Like I was like, if your pipeline is delivering every minute, but you delivering bad code and bad experience, and you just delivering crap to production. Like this doesn't win you any points at all, and making it go faster is not going to win you any points.
Absolutely. So when we talk about DORA metrics, and just forgive me for a second, I'll describe what they are for anyone that's listening. I'm sure everyone knows what they are, but just in case. So there are really 4 key metrics that DORA is known for. And those 4 key metrics, 2 are for throughput and 2 are for stability. And so basically the questions that we're asking with those measures are, how long does it take to get something into production? How frequently are you pushing things into production? How frequently do those pushes require an immediate rollback or hot fix? So something was bad about them. And then when something is bad about them, how long does it take to get the system back to a place where it's working well for your customers? So the 2 throughput metrics are those deployment frequency and your change lead time. And then the stability are the change fail rate and your time to restore. Now, here's the interesting thing. Those measures are particularly looking at the software delivery process. They are measuring software delivery performance, which is similar or like related to, but not the same as operational performance. And so actually in the last 4 or 5 years, DORA has started introducing more of a measure of operational performance to go along with that software delivery performance. The operational performance is much more about, well, first, it's much harder to measure because it is so very context specific, but it's much more about, is your service able to meet the needs, the expectations of its customers? Does it stay up? Is it responding fast enough? Is it giving them the correct information? These are very different measures. Of course, your ability to change the system with those software delivery measures, that can help you improve the operational performance of that system so that when something breaks, you can fix it very quickly, or you can fix it a little bit faster. But the other thing about those 4 metrics really quickly is those 4 metrics around software delivery performance are kind of based on this idea that the way we improve software delivery performance is that we ship smaller changes. Smaller batch sizes, continuously moving through, are easier to reason about, easier to roll back or fix if there's a problem. But we can't, like in a research way, we can't say, hey, what's your batch size? Hey, Sasha, how's your batch size? Is it small, medium, or large? Because your medium is going to be someone else's large and someone else's small. So we use those 4 measures, those throughput and stability measures, to get to a proxy of what is your batch size. And those measures, like all other measures, are proxies, and every proxy is a bad proxy for some way and in some shape. But also that's the tip of the iceberg with DORA. But now I'm going to stop because I know you want to.
So there, I want to come back to something you said a minute ago, so hopefully I don't forget. But the batch size is interesting because, like, if you look at it from that perspective, the batch size is actually very, very important to the quality of your software delivery.
Yes.
You're right. The smoother the change and the smaller the batch size, the better you're gonna do. And I think that it could be accurate to say that the companies that strive to go faster, kind of without fixing other problems, the problem is they're trying to shove the huge batch size into a faster delivery. So like
Yes.
they have this massive pile of mud and they're just like, how do we throw that pile of mud faster? And you can't. You should figure out a way to break up the pile of mud and to not have, say, every change affect every other change and like, have the
Yes.
testing only at the end by a human who looks at it
Yes.
once in 2 weeks. Like that type of stuff is.
Yes, absolutely.
I coming back to something that you said, that is very important. And that I think this is why I have sort of like a personal gravitation towards the reliability metrics a little bit more.
Mhm.
You said it's hard to measure because it's more contextual, but that's
Mhm.
also what makes it better because we come closer to the concept of value, right? Because
Mhm.
as long as what I'm measuring is how fast my code moves, like that, I can go on ChatGPT and generate a whole lot of code. Does it actually solve any problem? I don't know. Like generating code is easy, like, and
Mhm.
even quote unquote shipping features is not that hard, like, right? Um, and you when you measure, like, if you actually are trying to set like SLOs and stuff like that, you actually are forced to think about like what reliability really means. So like once you move beyond like my page returning 200 okay, which is also where a lot of people are, um, you start asking questions about like what do my users value, what should I look at that
Yes.
will be representative of how users interact with the software.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And the reason those software delivery metrics matter to that particular question is that we don't know. We don't know what our users value. And so if what we can do is run more experiments to learn more about our users, that's where software delivery performance starts to matter because
Yeah,
I can now
but
start
that's
shipping more
experiments.
changes. It's driving a different mindset. And this again is one of the challenges. Like, all right, so I've got these 4 metrics. That's all I need to do is measure these 4 metrics and make them better, and then everything will get better. It's, like I said, that's the tip of the iceberg. DORA fundamentally is the phrase I use to describe it is it's about getting better at getting better. How do we as a team, as an organization, adopt a mindset and a practice of continuous improvement? And we can't do that if we aren't improving how we deliver software. And importantly, if we aren't improving that experience for the users. So those operational performance metrics, things like service level objectives. Service level objectives are very, very difficult to get right because the service level objective is basically measuring your user happiness, that fundamentally requires a deep understanding of who your users are, why they're using the system, what they're doing with it, and that frankly can't come out of one department within your organization. That
Again,
again
those organizational
requires us all.
stakeholders and they need to agree,
Absolutely.
yes.
Yep.
But again, this is why like we many more people measure the DORA metrics or a subset of the DORA metrics and not
Hmm.
the S3 metrics or golden signals or SLOs. Like
Right.
that is again easier to do, right? And um but I think when you talk about DORA, you kind of setting up a context, and that context helps. But again, in the majority of conversations that I'm having with people, people focus on, and again, it's not even the 4 metrics. Usually, it's
Nope.
one or two, right?
Right.
And so it's like DORA said it's good, and that's why we're measuring this, and that's why this is a great thing. And so again, I'm not even sure if it's better to measure one thing or nothing at all, because sometimes when you measure like there is the oh my god, I am totally blanking on the person's name, but there's sort of like if you focus on an exclusion on one metric to on one metric exclusively, you're gonna
Hmm.
get what you're not asking for. Like you're gonna
Yes.
create a lot of paper clips, like, right?
Yes.
It's the you overdrive a metric for
Yes.
tons of cereal that you ship, and then
Right.
basically it creates results that you totally don't intend to have,
Right.
right?
Right.
So metrics, this is something we kind of mentioned but not particularly went into. Metrics need to be balanced, and part of the way to create good metric systems is to create things that balance each other, which again Dora tried to
Hmm.
do. It's just that people usually focus on one side of DORA, and also like
Right.
DORA doesn't cover absolutely everything. But one of the contextual things that you said was like DORA helps you do faster experiments, but that's if
Hmm.
you're doing experiments. Someone needs to have a hypothesis and then measure if hypothesis worked, right? If you're not doing that, all you're doing essentially is like how many lines of code are in production, how fast,
Yes,
okay?
yes, we have to bring that experimental mindset, that scientific approach to the changes that we're making. And this, I mean, this is it's fundamental to technology. We don't know what changing this one part of the system is going to do. We have to We have to test that out. We have to validate that. And I think maybe the phrase you were looking for is known as Goodhart's law. When a
Yep.
measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. Do you know, a thing I learned today is that while that's called Goodhart's law, it was actually Dame Marilyn Strathern that took what Goodhart said and turned it into that phrase that we all know and quote as Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to become a good measure. And so I think that the thing that we should all take away from this is whether you're looking at the 4 golden signals, whether you're looking at SLIs and SLOs, whether you're looking at DORA's 4 key metrics for software delivery performance, those metrics have to drive a conversation. We see that our batch sizes are getting bigger. Why is that? Let's have a conversation about that, and let's design some changes that we want to make on our team, within our organization. We see that we aren't meeting our SLOs. Let's have a conversation about that and figure out what do we need to change. And it's not about just hitting the SLO. It's about driving that change in behavior and that idea of continuous improvement.
Yeah, 100%. This was so good. I was like, do we finish on this phrase? Is that kind of but so speaking of Goodhart's law,
yes,
I actually, when I was doing some research on that, I found multiple like different laws like that are related to metrics and measurements, and
yes,
there's a few different things that go wrong with metrics. So like it's kind of very easy to get it wrong and over focusing on metrics in specific ways. So we are now in this part of the life cycle where collecting data is easy. And so in a lot of ways, we're over focused on collecting data, right? And not so much driving insight from that data. And basically the reaction of people who can't drive insight is usually, let's get more data. So we keep measuring and measuring and measuring. It's not always in software. Like this is very prominent in the public sector, because while you can't measure revenue, you start measuring other things. And again, this is like now over focusing on test performance, or like, again, things that are easy to measure that are actually making things worse if you take the holistic picture into account.
Absolutely. Call centers is a great example, right? How long did it take us to end that call that came into the call center? That can drive some really bad behaviors for your call center employees.
Absolutely. And
right?
and there's a lot, again, there's a lot of things that like are traditionally measured in a way that like you can very easily see how it's going to create problems, and it does, and that we kind of keep ignoring it, or we keep adding more metrics, but again, like not thinking about how we counterbalance the metrics, but just like, oh, let's just measure CPU as well. Like, right? It's like,
Right.
what does it actually tell you? We don't know, but like that's easy, right? This is why we also measure outcomes more, like measure activity more than we measure outcomes, is because activity is easy to measure, right? It's hard to say if we achieved our goals, but it's easy to say we hired 15 people, we spend this much budget, we opened a new branch, like whatever. Like so activity is a very easy thing.
That's right. And that's another place where things like the SPACE framework come into play, where SPACE stands for satisfaction and well-being, performance, activity, communication and collaboration, efficiency and flow. And the SPACE framework says, look, if you're going to set up some metrics, some goals for your team, you have to pick 2 or 3 of these 5. You shouldn't pick all 5 because maybe that's too many. But if you focus only on activity, you're going to get the wrong behaviors. If you focus only on performance, you potentially will get the wrong behaviors. So use that SPACE framework to really, like you said, find that balance. How do we measure these things? And at the end of the day, like, we are all working in complex systems that involve humans, and they all have emergent behaviors. And we have to embrace this idea that whatever measures we use, they're going to be wrong. Now, how wrong are they going to be? That's going to change over time. But we have to, we have to adopt this practice and mindset of continuous learning, continuous improvement. If we don't get there, I don't know. Let's find a happier note to end on.
No, I think this was like, this is kind of a good end to the conversation, just in the sense that like what we want to say is that measuring things is important, but measuring certain things just because they're easy and over focusing on them is probably gonna work very poorly, right?
Yes.
So we want the balance. We want to be thoughtful about the balance, and there's many ways to create balance. Like, right, there's many frameworks that try to help you do that. But the idea is that you should look at multiple things and
Yes.
potentially, again, counterbalancing things that will drive you to better result. And then you should also, again, this is something we haven't talked about, but like have the hypothesis in mind. So like that's another thing that happens a lot is people try to prove that they quote unquote did well, right?
Yes.
Whereas the spirit should be, we should try to prove that we accomplished the goal of the change. And if we didn't, it should be easy to revert and say, you know what, that A/B testing didn't work, the conversion rate didn't go up. We should just revert to the previous color of the button. Once we are attached emotionally to the color of the button, and it's easy to do because if you had to fight 20 people over the color of the button and you had to, get very invested in that change, and then you ship it and it like creates poor results, what you're going to do is you're going to try to convert the data to support that actually it's all good, it actually is great, otherwise you feel like you lost, right? And that's kind of not the goal of the entire thing.
Absolutely. And you need that passion from your employees. We want that. We want you to be passionate about the work that you're doing. And I think it's equally important. And this all goes back to also culture and that leadership and the approach that leadership takes. Like we have to be able to celebrate and learn from our failures in the same way that we celebrate and learn from our successes.
Yep. I think this is a thing that's kind of hard to do, but I think what I would say is like what's easier and probably interesting is we have to think about change in scientific fashion and like kind of hypothesis driven fashion,
Yes.
as opposed to, this was X person's idea, therefore if it works, that's X person's win, right? It's like we are going to experiment and see if it works, and if it doesn't, we learn something which makes us better, so we can try a different thing, right? As opposed to the highest paid person in the room said X.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's why we need to go and make sure that not only we implemented X, but also prove that X has worked and it's great, right? So it's humaning is complicated. Complex systems are made of people and technology, and making it all work together is complicated. But that's why we also like taking that investigative hat often helps, and being able to come at it from the outside, whether you work for the organization or you're outside the organization, and just take a look at it and step back and be like, how do we improve this thing? And sometimes it's very obvious. Sometimes you're like, I can see the bottlenecks. Sometimes it's not so obvious, but like sometimes you like you said, we know exactly what we're doing wrong. We just need to figure out how to create the change to do this better. And small steps usually are the way to go. Like, right, you're not going to overhaul the whole thing in one day, but you create that behavior change, and then you celebrate it, and then once people see it's better, it will again. This is another thing I want to mention is like people think that changing culture involves convincing people to believe in new ideas, but really culture changes when you change behavior. So you start with changing behavior.
That's
and
right.
Behavior sells itself. Like, right, once we get the dopamine from the activity giving us a positive result, we change.
Yes. There's a great phrase that's been attributed to a bunch of people, so I won't attribute it to anyone, but that phrase is that it's easier to change. Oh, let me get it right. It's easier to change the way that change the way you work to change the way you think than it is to change the way you think to change your way of working. So you change how you do the work. That's what drives that cultural change. That changes how you show up. And I'm sure I've botched that quote, but that's basically the idea. Change how you work to change how you think.
Ideas evolve, and we, all quote and misquote and steal them from each other. And but the research was done by Shane, and he has the model of like culture change, that like the behavior is what changes culture, not the opposite.
Yes, it's easier to change the. Never mind. I'm not even going to try it. I had it, and now it's gone.
All right. Well, and also learning. So I've heard this definition of learning recently from someone, and that was a good definition, which is like learning is defined by how much it changed your behavior. So like if you learn
Right.
something and it didn't create any change, then like it's not really useful. Whereas like if you learn a thing and it changes your behavior, you really actually advance towards something.
Right.
So
Yeah, it's also really interesting to think about the differences between teaching and learning, I think, and that kind of goes right to that. If yeah.
so tell me about teaching. I'm just
Oh,
interested
so
in
so
the
if
thought of
if
that.
if let's say you walk into a classroom and I'm there to teach you, and you walk out and you didn't change your behavior, you didn't learn anything. Well, it's because I failed to teach you. But if you came into a classroom and you were there to learn, like I'm here, this is a learning environment, and I've got maybe a coach that's going to help me learn. And I walked out and I changed my behavior. It's because I did learn. Right. And so just that mindset of like, hey, I walked into math class, my teacher is shite. They're no good. So I didn't learn any math. And you're gonna like push that blame onto the teacher, as opposed to I showed up to learn today. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna learn how to math.
Interesting. I think that this dynamic is very complicated. So it's like a whole thing.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's also there's also a difference. So there's difference between cognitive learning and practical learning, right? And so
Sure.
many skills only work if you learn them in like by doing. And
Yes.
surprisingly more skills than we think of
Yes.
need to
Yes.
be practiced. And so it's in our culture we kind of heavily gravitate towards cognitive learning. So we think if I explain an idea to you and you nodded and you said, okay, that looks like a good idea, then you're actually going to do it. But that's not what happens. It's my pet peeve. So back in Israel, like you could go to driving classes for
Uh-huh.
defensive driving, and there were classes. They were physically you can
Yeah.
drive, right? In America, it's almost impossible to find these classes. Like most of them are like, so they tell you how to defensively drive,
Right.
and I'm like, but I have never skidded on ice,
So
and
how do
if
I know?
the way I'm supposed to turn my wheel is counterintuitive, I
Mhm.
am giving you 100% and I'm going to do the intuitive thing unless you train it out of me, right? And it
Mhm.
doesn't matter that you told me 10 years ago or even 10 minutes ago how I'm supposed to turn the wheel. I will do what my instinct tells me to do, right? So the only way to train this is to physically try this. And
Yes.
there is that in software, even though it seems like a lot of cognitive process, like that there's the pinky, you know,
Yes. Yeah. Pinky, you're
muscle
hitting the
memory.
tab. You're hitting the tab. You know you should write better tests. You don't know how to write better tests because you've not done it. You know that, all of these things. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that brings me to another model, and that's BJ Fogg model, and that's about like behavioral change too, and he's responsible for all of us being addicted to social media because a lot of his ideas were basically used to kind of make humans stay on Instagram and such
Right.
places more.
Yeah.
Um, but he didn't come up with this to be evil. He came up with the ideas to basically help people change their behavior towards what they wanted to change it to. But one of the interesting things is that there was like enlightening to me is he basically was saying that a lot of times when you explain something to people and they don't change behavior is because they have no clarity about how to do it.
Hmm.
So you say something to someone like you're supposed to clean the coffee machine after every time you make a cup of coffee, and then they don't do it and you get progressively frustrated because you told them so many times and you're like, oh, you're resistant, you're a horrible person, you're making me do all the work, whatever. And if you just stop to be like, do you know how to clean the coffee machine?
Right.
You'll discover that they don't know how to physically open the coffee machine and take it out and wash it and without breaking it or whatever. And so this little lack of clarity creates total resistance to this change. And so they will give you other excuses because usually humans don't even think about it. They will not tell you that they don't understand how to do it. They will tell you like, oh yeah, I didn't have time or whatever. They will have all sorts of things, but we just miss that point where it's like it just wasn't clear.
Right. Yeah. Well, I hope this conversation has cleared up a bunch of things for a bunch of people.
Yeah, so I mean, this was a really interesting conversation. I'm super happy to have you here, and hopefully, we'll do this again sometime. It's a pleasure, and thank you everyone who came to listen to this podcast, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks
Bye.
so much, Sasha. Bye-bye.